Well, good morning. I want to welcome everyone to the Diversity Benchmark Initiative preview webinar with NC Tech. We're happy to have everyone with us this morning. I'm Andrea Fleming, Director of Talent and Workforce Development for NC Tech. Thank you for joining us and partners the Diversity Movement, RacePoint Global and Inclusion Analytics to learn about this benchmark and the role it can play in your diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. So after hearing from everyone this morning, we'll have time for questions. You can add those to the Q&A box or hold until the end if you'd like to unmute and ask your question. Laura has indicated she's okay with being interrupted if there's a question that's really appropriate for the particular slide that she's on right at that moment. So please feel free to do that as well. A little bit about NC Tech. We're a nonprofit membership-driven trade association. Primary voice for technology industry in North Carolina. Our mission is to foster growth and champion innovation in North Carolina's tech sector. We also provide a voice for that tech community across the state. Our membership has about 600 member companies, organizations, and institutions employing more than 200,000 workers in the state. And our work is in 4 major areas. We have professional networks, government affairs, sector promotion, and talent development. So diversity, equity, and inclusion really overlap each of these areas and are critical to the success of an organization, both for the current employees, but also really important for recruitment efforts. This benchmark, which started last year, really expands upon the NC Tech programming and events around diversity and inclusion by putting the metrics behind both the individual company efforts and also industry-wide for tech across North Carolina. We really want to find out where are tech companies in their progress towards improving diversity, equity, and inclusion policies and practices, and also how people at those companies view those policies and procedures. Are they actually being put into place? So really important, again, both for the company level, but also for the industry. So this effort combines with several other research projects that NC Tech produces each year. We have a Tech Innovation Index and State of Technology Industry Report. Both of those are annual. Those share data on the tech industry and document progress made in several areas, including DEI. So continued progress for policies and implementation really bolster company growth, talent attraction, and talent retention. So I mentioned our partners for this project. Kurt Merriweather with the Diversity Movement had a conflict this morning arise and couldn't join us. So I'll share a little bit about Diversity Movement and their role. They've been really strong partners with NC Tech in providing resources with their organization to help companies, once they find out where they are on that maturity scale for DEI, how can they continue that positive movement forward. They have a suite of employee experience applications for organizations to really add and enhance their efforts. They have training modules. They have a new product called a DEI Navigator, and also several podcasts and blogs, and are really not only local and statewide experts, but national experts in the arena. TDM enables companies to really move your efforts forward, and with a big focus on real world positive business outcomes for doing so. So very important issue. It does all come down to making a business case for it. And another partner, RacePoint Global, has worked with North Carolina Tech for many years. Stephanie Syons joins us today. Stephanie, would you like to make a few comments about your part in the project?
Oh, sure. So we are a communications agency with an office in Raleigh, but also around the country. And what we're finding is that there's a lot of companies talking about diversity. And the question is, how are they talking about it? You know, our role has always been, and our mission has always been, to help companies shape conversations that matter. Diversity absolutely is one of those conversations. And we as an organization feel that diversity can also be a part of a story that you can tell. And, you know, we love to tell stories. It's a great part of who a company is. And an initiative like this is a beautiful part of that. So if you can make diversity a part of who you are, and really talk about it internally and externally, an initiative like this could really help you as you benchmark it and move forward. So we are excited to be a part of this discussion today and a part of the initiative moving forward. So welcome you all for being here. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephanie. And now I'd like to introduce Laura Brooks-Doolin with Inclusion Analytics to walk us through the NC Tech Diversity Benchmark Initiative. Tracy Sternberg, who many of you know from NC Tech, connected with Inclusion Analytics at a conference for tech councils throughout North America. She's heard the presentation from Laura and her partner and really wanted to bring this effort to North Carolina. So we're really happy to have Laura here with us today. And with that, I'll hand it over to Laura.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andrea. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. As Andrea said, my name is Laura Brooks-Doolin. I am a co-founder of Inclusion Analytics, where our mission is to create workplaces that work for all. And we do this through a data-driven approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion. What that means for this group is that we will be using a series of assessments to collect data and help your companies understand which DEI efforts are successful and which ones may need retooling in order to have their intended impact. Today, we'll spend some time talking about how participating in this process as a group can help to support strategic planning moving forward. So to quickly review our agenda, first we're going to discuss some macro level changes that we've seen throughout the past couple of years. We'll then review the content of our assessments, and we will close the presentation by talking about the process that will be going on through the end of this year and the beginning of next year. We should have plenty of time at the end for questions and answers, but as Andrea said, she will be monitoring the chat for me and she'll interrupt me at any time in order to ask some questions that are important to the content we're going through. So in a 2020 survey conducted by Glassdoor, they found that DEI was a high priority for candidates. Over 76% of candidates reported that they prioritize a diverse workforce. And this statistic increases to 80% when you focus on Black and Latina populations, as well as the LGBTQ job seekers. Nearly a third of candidates said that they wouldn't even apply to a company that lacks diversity. And unfortunately, a lot of these survey participants said that they reported quitting a job because they either witnessed or they experienced discrimination. So this is a huge priority for those job seekers. So data like this, as well as other calls to actions from civil rights movements such as Black Lives Matter, there have been huge numbers of announcements from tech companies regarding their efforts around DEI. So let's dig into a little bit about how representation has changed. So I pulled the demographic reports from Apple, Google, and Meta's 2018 and 2021 diversity reports. What we're seeing is that there has been an increase in representation of women from about 33% to 34.8%. Google is only seeing an increase from 31.6% to 32.2%, and Meta from 36.3% to 36.7%. Likewise, Black representation went from 9% to 9.4% at Apple, 3.3% to 4.4% at Google, 3.5% to 4.4% at Meta. And for the Latina population, we increased from 14% to 14.8% at Apple, 5.7% to 6.4% at Google, and 4.9% to 6.5% at Meta. So over these 3 years depicted, even with all of these really large diversity promises, these companies have seen a really small amount of growth in representation of women, Black employees, and Latina employees. In addition to that, this data starts to end around 2021. The 2022 diversity reports haven't fully been launched yet. So that doesn't take into account the Great Resignation trends, where about 57 million employees quit their jobs between January 2021 and February of 2022. And unfortunately, this is mid-level employees that are ranging in ages from 30 to 45 that are quitting at the highest rates. That means that there's a wealth of institutional knowledge, skills, and experiences that are really valuable to those employers. In addition to that, about 55% of the individuals who left a technology job left their industry altogether. So a lot of those skills and knowledge bases aren't even being used anymore. The most often cited reason for why people are leaving is low pay, no opportunity for advancement, and feeling disrespected. So if your company is trying to acquire some of this talent that is leaving other companies, it's really important to understand the demographic characteristics of who you're competing for. So like I said, this group that's most often leaving is between 30 to 45 years old. Oftentimes that's peak of child rearing responsibilities. So things like flexible work hours or some work-life balance benefits may be important considerations for those job seekers. Your company can become more attractive and better support employees when you understand what their needs are and adapt your policies to match that. In any case, data can really help you understand what your current workforce needs, as well as what other potential employees could need. So how do we protect the growth that we've had, even though it's been minimal, and how do we continue to grow? There are a lot of best practices when it comes to improving DEI in the workforce. Some of the most cited efforts that are being cited by the CEOs who signed the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion include things like greater transparency and diversity data. So that's those diversity reports I was talking about. Development of a formal diversity supply chain program, which helps to increase equitable spend across your community. Cross-industry collaboration efforts like the one that NC Tech has launched with this benchmarking study. And of course, what I find really important is measuring your impact. And why I think this is so important is because, as I mentioned earlier, half of Black and Latina employees have indicated that they left a job due to discrimination. However, many employees don't provide their employer with this type of information before they leave. In fact, about 71% of employees said that they would be more likely to share their DEI opinions with their company if they had an anonymous way to do so. So this benchmarking study can help you provide that anonymous outlet to understand where your employees are satisfied and where they might be falling through the cracks. This data can help you to keep up with best practices and hopefully retain those employees that we see leaving so often. So next, we're going to go over the content of our assessments that we will be providing to you all. So at Inclusion Analytics, when we think about DEI data, we consider 4 topic areas. First, we examine the demographics or the diversity of the workforce. By doing so, we can see whether there's differences across groups and whether or not they have equitable opportunities throughout the organization. Policy reviews can help us to identify barriers that might be holding customers, employees, and partners back, as well as potentially slowing business progress. We then look at employee perceptions of those policies to make sure that those practices that you're engaging in are having their intended impact. And finally, we look at the inclusion culture, which we think is a critical lever to pull for DEI success, because your employees are engaging with the company culture all day, every day. So we'll dig a little deeper into each of these categories. So when we talk about demographic analyses, these help us to target where the barriers might exist to ensure that we have equitable representation across levels of the organization, departments, and job functions. So identifying where the inequities exist can help us to know whether we should target selection processes, promotion practices, incentives, and succession planning. On this side, we see some of the racial ethnic data by level from last year's benchmarking study. And as you can see, as we move up the career ladder, the percentage of Asian and Latina employees begins to slow down. We see a sort of hourglass pattern with our Black and African American employees, where there are very few individuals at the management level, but the top leader and individual contributor levels are about the same. So what these patterns indicate to me is that it may not necessarily be recruitment for individuals into the organization, but we might be struggling with things like retention or have issues with access to promotion that need to be examined. So in this segment of our policies assessment, we ask a business representative, usually that's an HR leader or team, to identify how many employees fit into different professional categories. For example, how many people of each gender are individual contributors, managers, and top leaders. In the second quadrant of our DEI circle, we explore the presence of policies across 6 different categories. From the overall vision to the entire employee life cycle, companies can add different policies or maybe tweak existing policies to make them more inclusive. So one example is that of inclusive job requirements. Let's consider a UX designer whose job is to design a website for an organization. Some employees may go the extra mile and research to make sure the website is accessible. But it can become a simple part of the job description to ensure that within the project, each employee is reviewing the web content accessibility guidelines. Such policies can help bake inclusion into each employee's job. So in this second segment of the policies assessment, the HR representative or team would indicate yes or no to whether a company has a variety of policies and practices formally documented and operating. In order to help guide our decision-making, we group organizations along a maturity model based on their reported policies. So an organization that would fall into the foundational level would maybe have a few DEI-related policies, but they likely exist in a silo, maybe in the HR department, and usually they're required by regulation. Once we move into the awareness category, the efforts focus on training and education, and employees are starting to really engage in those opportunities. Organizations that are in the application phase are embedding DEI into some of their practices, and the employees and leaders are starting to be expected to embody those values. And then finally, in the integration phase, DEI is integrated into all people and business processes, and the company starts to extend their efforts beyond their office walls, like through workforce development. Once an organization is identified within one of these areas, it helps us to prioritize what their best next steps should be. We don't necessarily want a company that's within their foundational level to start implementing policies in the integration phase. We want to make sure that as they're growing this program, they're gaining input from their employees and they're educating them about what DEI growth means for the company as they continue to change. Here we see last year's distribution along the maturity levels, in which the majority of our organizations fell within the awareness and application phases. What I take away from these results is that there are a ton of really great resources that are right here in the NC Tech membership. And collaboration between organizations can help to grow our programs to make North Carolina a destination for employees that are prioritizing DEI. So next we'll dive into more specific results examples that individual organizations would receive. So here we have an example of the policy benchmarking results. On the left, you can see how the organization responded to each policy. And on the right, you can see how their peers responded. In this example, the organization provides floating holidays and has a supplier diversity program, which other organizations don't have. However, they do not conduct physical space audits, and they do not provide employee resource groups, whereas most of their peers do provide this. These gaps in policies provide the organization with identified next steps to potentially expand their inclusion efforts. Fortunately, because many of their peers do have ERGs, if that's something that the organization wants to implement, they have many resources within their own community to tap. As organizations will receive this level data, all organizations will receive this level of data as well as their maturity model if they participate in the benchmarking study. Now, I want to warn you, the next slide has a lot of data on it, but we will be going through it step by step, so don't worry about taking it all in at once. Organizations will also have the option to opt in to measure their employees' perceptions of their policies and practices. So as policymakers, we often get really caught up in what's on the books, and we spend a lot of resources in providing those policies and resources. However, we're not really sure how managers are communicating those things or how employees are perceiving them. So in this example of our integrated data, we see that this organization provides a benefit analysis every year. You can see that by the teal check mark. Less than half of their peers are engaging in this same practice. Then if we move to the employee data, we see that about half of their employees are indicating that benefit packages do not support all family structures. And when we break that data down even further by caregiver status, we're seeing that the biggest gap is with caregivers that are caring for adults, whether that's adult children or parents. So clearly the stated policy differs from what employees are experiencing. This is why it's so important to ask employees about their experiences to understand whether the policies we're implementing are having their impact and whether or not they're working better for some employees over others. So while the organization is completing the policy assessment, employees are providing feedback on their experiences with these policies through the people assessment. So finally, we recommend exploring your company's inclusion culture, which includes 4 critical elements: belonging, exclusion, fairness, and psychological safety. So belonging looks at whether employees feel like they're a valued part of the company and whether or not their company truly makes them feel like they belong. In contrast, we look at direct exclusion, which examines feelings of being left out, for example, formal, important meetings, or maybe informal functions like going to lunch with your coworkers each day. Fairness looks at whether employees believe the same rules apply equally to everyone. And finally, psychological safety is the feeling that an employee can speak up or disagree without being punished. Together, these 4 elements help us to understand employee experiences and inclusion culture, allowing leaders to develop and maybe better communicate policies and programs to ensure that the workplace is welcoming to all workers. So this is the second segment of the people assessment, where employees provide their experiences with these 4 factors of inclusion culture. So to summarize what our assessments look like, the policies and practices assessment consists of 2 primary parts. First, the demographic breakdown of employees overall and by level, as well as questions focused on organizational policies. If you opt in, your employees will complete the people and perceptions assessment, which measures employee perceptions of the policies, as well as their perceptions of the company inclusion culture. Employees should expect to spend about 10 minutes on that survey. So I'll wrap up the presentation by reviewing the process for completing the assessments. There will be 2 options available for participation this year. You can either complete the policies only option or engage in our dual assessment that includes both the policies and the people and perceptions options. So each participating business can expect multiple deliverables that will help support their decision-making and DEI growth. Businesses that opt into either option will receive their placement on the maturity model, an executive summary that indicates their next prioritized steps. And because you all will be participating as an association, you'll have access to those industry comparisons. But we can only provide those comparisons if 10 organizations participate. So please encourage your peers to join this year. We will also be providing all of that information in a PDF report if the organization decides to do policies and practices only. For those who opt in to do both the policies and the people assessments, you'll receive everything I indicated so far, but we will also provide you with interactive dashboards that include data summaries for quick insights, as well as the ability to dive in deeper to your data. You'll be receiving employee perception data that will help you know what your employees need. And we'll be providing an optional meeting with Inclusion Analytics to review dashboards and results to make sure that you can make the most of your data. Finally, for the organizations that sign up for this dual assessment, you'll be receiving a certificate or badge that you can either post on LinkedIn or to your company website to verify that you are investing in your employees. This is a great way to message to potential job seekers that DEI is a priority for your team. Likewise, NC Tech will be receiving multiple deliverables to facilitate next steps. The association will receive aggregate data that visualizes strengths and opportunities for the group. They will not be able to see individual organization responses. They'll be able to use this data to develop programming and invest in resources that can support the greatest number of businesses. And finally, demographic data will be aggregated across the businesses, like in the charts I showed you earlier, in order to forecast future opportunities for North Carolina. This type of cross-industry collaboration helps to identify areas in which businesses can support each other and what type of development opportunities the group as a whole should invest in order to attract employees to North Carolina. So in order to participate, we have the following expectations for each organization. First, we ask you that you identify an appointed point person for Inclusion Analytics to send links to, keep updated on participation rates, and deliver the final report to. We ask that the organizations complete their assessments within the allotted timeframes during the Inclusion Analytics representative will be available to answer any questions. That will likely be me. If you're completing the assessment for your people, we ask that you strive to get about 70% participation rate so that we know you have a representative sample. And we ask that as an organization, you're frequently communicating with employees in order to keep this participation rate high. Finally, your payment will be due to NC Tech based on your membership status as well as your size. And there's a lot of information here, but Andrea will be sending out a follow-up email that will include this in a PDF. So lastly, I want to go through what our timeline looks like. Right now, we're in phase 1, where we are providing information and answering any questions that you might have as a business. The registration is already open and will close mid-November, so please sign up before then. In phase 2, will launch the assessments, and both the business representatives and the employees will have the opportunity to participate. Each business will select a 2-week window within that 2-month time frame for whatever works best for them, depending on what other engagement initiatives they have going on and that type of thing. And then finally, in phase 3, Inclusion Analytics will analyze the data and create the reports. At that point, we will provide association-wide communication and group-level data will go out. And then finally, member businesses will receive their customized reports. So that is the end of my material for today. I would love to spend the rest of the time answering your questions. And it looks like we have a few in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing.
So Laura, can you see those or do you want me to read them out?
I can go ahead and see them. Okay, so how do you see corporate responsibility and environment, social, and governance goals supporting DEI goals? How can these programs best work together? So when I think of DEI in relation to corporate social responsibility, I see them as really integrated within each other in order to make sure that you are being a good social steward as a company. You need to make sure that you're engaging in equity practices with your organization or with your employees within your organization, with your potential job seekers, and with things like supplier diversity, where you're making sure that you're spending your money in an equitable way to increase equity throughout your community. Our next question is, are there any changes in the survey questions from the assessment earlier this year, or will we be able to directly compare changes for the same questions? Yes, that's a really, really great question. So overall, the assessment is staying the same. That way we can continue to see growth. We want to make sure that the policies that were gaps last year are continuing to improve and that our employee perceptions are improving as well. We will also provide potential new questions. DEI is always evolving. So the things like caregiver status, that wasn't in the assessment last year, but we'll be adding it to the assessment this year. So there will be a few tweaks, but overall it'll be based on growth.
Laura, I think Stephanie wanted to chime in on that first
yes.
question about corporate social responsibility.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't figure out how to do it in the chat. So my apologies. But Suzanne, I think another way to look at it, and I think Laura's points were all wonderful, is to really roll them into a communications and messaging document as you do your CSR and your ESG work. We've seen a lot of companies meld them all together so it's a part of your overall narrative and your messaging, both from an internal and an external standpoint. And, you know, happy to talk more about that, but you're right on in how they flow together. And it's not necessarily a fine line, but I think there's ways to do it where you're not looking like you're trying to be opportunistic or leverage it in an uncredible way. I think there's a wonderful opportunity there to definitely leverage it from a communication standpoint.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. That was really helpful. All right. Finally, what if organization has employees outside of North Carolina? So all organizations will have the opportunity to invite any employees that are throughout the United States. And if there are enough employees within the North Carolina sample and throughout the rest, we will be breaking that data down for you so you can understand what the difference is between the individuals who are maybe at your headquarters versus the individuals who are maybe remote employees, things like that. So you have the opportunity to have all of your US employees participate. However, it needs to stay within the United States due to data sharing laws. Were there questions in the chat?
There weren't any others in the chat, and you can raise your hand if you would like to be unmuted and ask your question. Laura, I really appreciate all of the very detailed slides. I will share those out to all of the attendees, along with a PDF about the pricing options and participation options, because you do have choices. That is one thing that has changed a little bit more from last year to this year, is how deep do you want to dive in? We definitely encourage companies to participate in both the policies and the people part. One is more, kind of that benchmark, but you can have your policies, but really being able to find out what your employees think, how they see those policies being implemented is a really critical step as well. And we're happy to answer questions about that, about how you make your choices and how you fill out the registration form if you choose to participate this year. So I don't see any other questions coming in. Are there any final comments, Laura, Stephanie?
I don't think so. Thank you all for joining us today, and feel free to reach out with any additional questions you might have.
Yes,
Thank
and
you,
I will
everybody.
include everyone's contact information in the email that goes back out as well. So you can reach out if you have questions for any of the three of us. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.